person.
Slept in, didn't you? Didn't wake up till like 10 o'clock.
First thing, everybody's cell phones are off, correct? And those are your notepads, correct? You'll need another one. Very good. Jury's in the jury box.
And it's you.
Thank you. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. 20-minute delay's nothing like yesterday, but sorry we couldn't be on time. Anybody have anything they need to tell me? Okay, thank you. Ms. Manuel is going to resume her direct of Dr. Otto.
Good afternoon, Dr. Otto.
Good afternoon.
I believe when we left off yesterday, we were talking about some testing that you did during your evaluation of Mr. Jonchuck.
Yes.
Did you administer any type of testing during the 3 times that you met with him?
Yes, I did.
And could you explain those?
I administered, as I indicated yesterday, the structured interview of reported symptoms designed to identify people exaggerating or fabricating symptoms of psychosis, more serious symptoms like hearing voices, seeing things, being terribly impaired cognitively in terms of how you're thinking or what you're thinking. Paranoid delusions, grandiose delusions, things like that. The results of that test indicated no attempt by Mr. Jonchuck when I evaluated him to exaggerate or fabricate. I also administered 2 different but very similar tests. One's called the Mini Mental State Examination, and one's called the Montreal Cognitive Assessment. These are very gross, abbreviated measures designed to identify people experiencing significant impairments in their cognitive functioning, in things like attention, memory, understanding language, expressing language. But they're very brief measures designed to only identify the most gross impairments.
Okay.
And I administered each measure. I saw him 3 times. 2 of those occasions I administered one of those measures that are very similar in terms of what they do. During my first meeting with Mr. Jonchuck, there were some indications that his attention and concentration was impaired. And when I administered it the second time around, he generally did better. But I still had some concerns about problems with attention and concentration, but certainly not that they rose to the level that he was unable to interact with me or understand what I was asking him or express himself and participate.
Okay.
And then finally, I administered a test called the Personality Assessment Inventory. It's a self-report test, right? A paper and pencil test where you're asked about life experiences, you're asked about psychiatric symptoms, that some things like depression and anxiety. You're asked about your history of contact with the legal system. You're asked about your use of drugs and alcohol. The results of that test indicated that he was being straight, He wasn't exaggerating and fabricating problems, nor was he denying or minimizing, right? Because I wouldn't really pay attention to the results of the test if there were indications of exaggeration or fabrication, or he was trying to hide problems. However, I administered that test twice during 2 of the meetings. The first time, he answered similar items in very inconsistent ways. There's over 300 questions on the test. Some of the questions get to similar kinds of things. So one of the things we do is we look at how you answered this question, and we look at how you answered this question that are very similar. And if you answer enough of those questions inconsistently, we don't have much confidence in the results of the test. Either you weren't paying attention, or your attention was impaired, or you were doing the old Christmas tree approach to taking a standardized test. So in any case, the first time I administered that test, I didn't even bother to interpret the results because there were indications that he just wasn't responding consistently. I asked him about that.
Okay.
When I saw him next, he said, well, if you remember, doctor, you sort of administered that test at the end of the session, and I was pretty distressed and distracted and upset. Maybe that's the explanation, but I promise I was trying my hardest. So I said, let's give it another try. We gave it another try. He answered the items in a more consistent manner, consistent enough so I had confidence that I could look at the test results and make sense of them. No indications of exaggeration or fabrication, no indications of denying problems. And when I looked at the results of that testing, it suggested a whole range of problems, including difficulties with depression, difficulties with anxiety, acknowledging a history of substance abuse, acknowledging a history of contact with the law, acknowledging a history of problematic relationships with other people, volatile, intense relationships, not good relationships. And it also suggested emotional lability, poorly controlled emotions. Now, keep in mind, that test tells me mostly about how the person's doing as he sits in front of me. Some of it also, of course, gives me information about the past, like whether you've ever abused drugs, or whether you ever abused alcohol, or whether your relationships have been a problem for you in the past. So all of that is descriptive, I think, but it's important that I put those results in context. Those test results told me primarily about how he was doing when we were meeting, not about how he was doing years before on the evening of the offense. Although I acknowledge some of those items and some of the scales of the test do provide you with historical information, like whether you've ever been in trouble with the law, whether you've abused alcohol or drugs in your life, etc.
And is it uncommon that people who suffer from severe and persistent mental illness also have a history of drug or alcohol abuse?
Many people with severe and persistent mental illness also have problems with substances. We have a word for it. Sometimes it's referred to co-occurring disorders. A substance abuse problem along with schizophrenia, a substance abuse problem along with something like manic depressive illness, a substance abuse problem along with serious problems with depression. That's not uncommon at all.
What about, is it common for people with severe and persistent mental illness to also have problems, volatile relationships?
Some people with severe and persistent mental illness have volatile or very problematic interpersonal relationships, but not all of them, for sure. That in and of itself is not an indicator of severe and persistent mental illness.
What about Mr. Jonchuck's, that you indicated he had a history of poorly controlled emotions?
Yeah, what we refer to as emotional lability,
right.
Having difficulty controlling your emotions, or at least not controlling your emotions.
Is that consistent with his mental health diagnosis that you've issued in the case?
Yeah, it's consistent, and that supports my diagnosis of schizoaffective disorder.
Did you review some records from Dr. Arthur in reaching your opinion?
I did.
And the records that you reviewed, about what years are we talking about there?
If I remember correctly, but I'm just going to verify by reviewing my report, I believe Dr. Arthur treated Mr. Jonchuck between 2011 and 2013. April 2011 through December of 2013. They were the records I reviewed.
Now, so that's about a year and a half prior to our date of offense when he stopped seeing Dr. Arthur. Why would you, oh, I'm sorry, no?
About a year and a little.
Okay. Why would you review those records and forming your opinion? Or why would you want to review those records?
Just to sort of go back to something we talked about yesterday, one of the main tasks of the mental health professional in this context is at the time of the offense, was the person experiencing symptoms of mental disorder? And so I'm trying to make sense of whether that was the case, and any kinds of records indicating treatment or an absence of records suggesting no treatment is relevant to making sense of whether the person might have been experiencing symptoms of mental illness at and around the time of the offense. For example, if someone lived their whole life completely healthy and they do something very terrible and very criminal and they say, oh, I have a mental illness, we're a little more suspect than if a history of documented mental illness was well established before then. So not only did reviewing Dr. Arthur's records allow me to ascertain that yes, long before Mr. Jonchuck's interactions with Phoebe on the evening of her death, he experienced and displayed symptoms of mental disorder. Doesn't prove that he was experiencing symptoms of mental disorder when he put his daughter over the bridge, but it's relevant to understanding that. And it also gives me some insight into the kinds of problems and the kinds of symptoms he's experienced in the past and might well have been experiencing on the evening of the offense.
What did Dr. Arthur diagnose or treat Mr. Jonchuck for, best you can tell from the records?
His diagnosis was bipolar disorder. In the old days, that used to be called manic depressive illness. And that's characterized by intermittent, alternating periods of depression, down, blue, low, lacking energy, feeling bad about yourself, maybe thinking about suicide, and periods of lots of energy, feeling great, feeling wonderful, too much energy, feeling too good about yourself. Bipolar disorder. That was the diagnosis, and I believe a diagnosis of attention deficit disorder.
Okay. Did he also diagnose him with anxiety disorder then?
Now that you say it, I believe so, yes. Just slipped my mind.
Okay. And if you need to refer to the records, I have a copy I can provide you if you need to.
I look at my report, and what I wrote here was bipolar disorder diagnosis, generalized anxiety disorder diagnosis, and attention deficit disorder diagnosis. They were Dr. Arthur's diagnoses.
Did John indicate back then when he was being treated by Dr. Arthur that he would have problems with sleeping at night?
Mr. Jonchuck reported to Dr. Arthur problems with sleep, among many other problems.
Did he also report back then, well, I guess let me ask you this. Did Mr. Jonchuck report issues with having problems sleeping at and around the time of offense?
Mr. Jonchuck reported to me he was not sleeping well in the period leading up to the offense.
Did Mr. Jonchuck indicate back at the time with Dr. Arthur that his anxiety was much more severe at night than during the daytime?
I don't remember.
Would it refresh your recollection to review the records?
Sure. Could you repeat the question?
I'm sorry, did Mr. Jonchuck indicate back when he was being treated by Dr. Arthur that his anxiety was worse at night?
There's a note here on the first page referencing that. And I remember reading that now.
Was there evidence that you observed that that Mr. Jonchuck was experiencing great anxiety during the night and the days surrounding Phoebe's death?
I'm not sure I would say he was experiencing anxiety. Certainly that, there was evidence that he wasn't sleeping in a regular way and that he was very active and taking care of a lot of things in the middle of the night. Phone calls and messages and email messages and text messages and things like that. I don't know if I would characterize that as anxiety.
Were you able to determine if John stopped taking his psychiatric medication at some point prior to December, January 2014, 2015?
I think I was.
Okay. What information did you receive about that?
Well, Mr. Jonchuck reported to me that he wasn't receiving mental health treatment from anyone other than Dr. Arthur while an adult. And then Dr. Arthur's treatment records stopped in December of 2013, and this offense occurred. Well over at least a year later. So if he wasn't in treatment, Dr. Arthur wasn't able to continue prescribing medications. Mr. Jonchuck reported that the medications ran out at some point in time, and when they ran out, I think he gave me varying estimates of between 2 and 4 months, I think.
Okay. And did you observe in Dr. Arthur's records that Mr. Jonchuck had attempted to refill a Seroquel prescription in September of 2014?
There was a note at the very end of Dr. Arthur's records from a pharmacy, I believe, where he attempted to refill one of the medications Dr. Arthur had prescribed, but it was rejected. It wasn't filled.
What is Seroquel normally prescribed for?
Antipsychotic or psychotic symptoms. Also has some antidepressant and mood stabilizing effects.
When you met with John, did you ask him what happened?
Yes.
How do you go about getting that information? Do you start with very specific questions, general questions? Explain that to us.
Well, the way I do this and the way we recommend we do it in our training at the university in terms of how to go about doing these evaluations is that you start, one, let the defendant establish when he or she believes it's important to start. Do we need to start a week before this all happened, or maybe it's 2 months? So we initially let the defendant set the context in terms of where we start, okay? Because their perspective may be important. And then it's a bunch of this, and then what, and then what, and then what, and then what. And what we're doing as an interviewer is we're pushing the person we're interviewing to tell us everything they can remember about what occurred. So it's a lot of and then what, and then what, and then what, and it's also a lot of clarifications of pronouns. Because it's amazing how consistently when people tell stories, they'll be kind of letting you know what happened, and then the tendency is just to use she. So with Mr. Jonchuck, for example, he would say something like, well, and then I told her to do this. And, well, is that your mom? Is that your stepmom? Is that Phoebe? Is that the attorney? So there's a lot of, hold on, who is she? And actually, we start these interviews by saying, try to avoid pronouns. Try to give us names. So we try to get everything we can from the defendant. Now, obviously, before we evaluate the defendant, we know a lot about what went on based on reviewing the arrest reports, and maybe there were witness statements and things like that. So we try to get out everything we can from the defendant, and we also caution them, hey, all we want from you is what you remember. Don't tell us something that you read in the newspaper. Don't tell us something that your mother told you. during her last jail visit. That's not your memory. What I want is what you remember and how you were thinking and how you were feeling and how you were behaving. That's what this is all about. How were you thinking, feeling, and behaving at and around the time of the offense? And does that suggest you were experiencing symptoms of mental disorder at and around the time of the offense? And did those symptoms make it so you might not have known what you were doing or might not have known the wrongfulness of what you were doing? So we do that, and then once I've determined, or once other examiners have determined that they have, to the best of his or her ability, the defendant's recollection, all that he remembers, we might begin to ask them questions based on other information we have, right? At the grossest level, this is not referencing Mr. Jonchuck's case in particular, but you might have someone who said, oh, I robbed the 7-Eleven and then I just hung out and drank a beer with the cashier. Okay. Well, that's interesting because the cashier, when she wrote up her statement, she said you robbed the 7-Eleven and then you ran out as soon as you saw the police car show up. That's a little different. Help me understand that. Help me understand that discrepancy there. Or sometimes the defendant might sort of lay out his story, lay out her story, and there's other things you know occurred that she didn't report. He didn't report. Well, you know, whoever I'm interviewing, you told me about this, this, and this, but do you remember anything about this event? And sometimes the defendant says, oh yeah, I forgot that. Let me tell you about that. Sometimes they tell you, I have no memory for that. I don't remember that. And sometimes they tell you, oh, something like that happened, but that's not exactly accurate. And all we're trying to do is, as best we can, at least from one of the relevant parties, the defendant, get some information that will ultimately inform our opinion about how the person was thinking, feeling, and behaving at and around the time of the offense. And then we're going to compare that account to all other kinds of accounts. The officer who stopped him, the officers who interrogated him, the attorney who met with him 12 hours before, the father and stepmother who interacted with him in the days preceding, the friends that received text messages, the relatives that received text messages. We put all that together and we're trying to make sense of what we believe the person was experiencing, how they were functioning as it goes to the sanity definition or standard.
Gotcha. Is there a concern when you said you're trying to get to just what Mr. Jonchuck remembers? Is there a concern, or is it unusual, I guess, would it be unusual that when you're evaluating somebody years after the fact, their answers are how they imagine or perceive now, them trying to, I guess, piece together the past versus what I was thinking at this time? Is that hard to separate out?
Okay, let me give you this answer and see if it's responsive. I'll tell you this, whenever anyone talks to you about something that happened in the past, and the more distant, the more significant this is we're concerned about accuracy, right? I'm concerned about the accuracy of my memory for the evaluation, right? Mm-hmm. I imagine some of the other witnesses who came up here and told you what they remembered happening years ago, maybe they had an incomplete memory, and everyone on the jury has had experiences where you've forgotten at least some things, maybe even some important things. So, right, there's the problems with memory, and we just tend to forget at least some things. So that's a challenge. The second thing is our memories can be contaminated. You can have a memory of an event, but then you talk about it with other people, and then maybe you sort of incorporate it into your story, and you come to think that you remember it when you really didn't. It's not your memory. It's someone's memory that you adopted. You're not trying to be deceptive, but that happens, and that happens to all of us. Then the third challenge here is, what if you're impaired when the important stuff's going on? What if you're impaired by symptoms of mental illness? What if you're impaired by the effects of Jack Daniels, right? Many people who drink too much alcohol say, you know what, I don't remember everything. And one thing we know is that if you're intoxicated, you're going to have a more limited memory. Now, Mr. Jonchuck didn't report that he was under the influence of any substances at the time of at or around the time of the offense, so I want to make that clear. But I believe, as I suggested yesterday, he was experiencing symptoms of severe and persistent mental illness, confused thinking, irrational thinking, hallucinations, paranoid delusions, grandiose delusions, and what we know is those symptoms can impair people's ability to perfectly encode and then at a later point in time perfectly remember what happened. So all those factors can go into limiting someone's memory for what occurred and affecting the accuracy of what they report. One of the ways that people routinely deal with the challenge of memory is they write stuff down, right? That's why police officers write reports, because it's fresh in their mind, right? That's why I take notes. Most defendants don't write down what happened right after they were arrested. So that's an ongoing challenge. And most of us in our everyday lives don't write down what happened after a significant event, unless it's a very meaningful event and we're told to do that. And that helps our memory.
Gotcha. So when you asked generally for John to kind of tell you when did this start, or where was his start point, or what was the first thing that he kind of directed you to?
His starting was in the weeks leading to the offense. And what he shared with me was he shared this increasing focus on religious issues. And one of the first things he mentioned was his stepmother's Swedish Bible that you've heard repeated references to, that it was knocking, that it had special meaning. He became very concerned about his well-being, the well-being of his daughter and his family. And that was sort of the evolution of what occurred. That's where it started from his perspective. That actually was consistent with deposition testimony of his father and deposition testimony of his mother. I reviewed those depositions. I believe they testified. My recollection is both of them remembered changes in Mr. Jonchuck's behavior. I think they both said 2 weeks before the offense, which would put it to maybe the third week of December, if my math is correct.
Did John bring up to you a fight that he had with his mother in the middle of the night?
I remember a discussion of an argument. I don't have any clear of a memory for it other than there was an argument of some type.
Would it refresh your recollection to review your depo transcript? I'm looking at page 32 of your depo.
Well, I know I testified to the fact that he said that he woke his mother up and told her that he could read her mind. I remember testifying to that fact, but I don't see anything there referencing a fight per se.
Okay, so John indicated that he woke his mother up in the middle of the night and accused her of reading his mind.
I think it was that he could read her mind.
Okay, I'm sorry. He was reading her mind.
He could read her mind.
Okay.
That's what he said.
And this is the same night, was this the same night that he left the house with Phoebe and his cousin?
The night before he left the house, yeah.
Did John tell you about that he believed that he was speaking to his mother as though he was her mother?
Around the time of the offense, Mr. Jonchuck was confused about who was whose parents, both in terms of his relationship with his mother as well as his relationship with his daughter. So there was confusion in his mind around those issues, or so he reported. And I'm just looking at my notes to see if there were other, So my interview with Mr. Jonchuck revealed that there was some confusion in his head around that time as to who was whose parent. I reviewed the deposition of Mr. Jonchuck's mother, and she testified that he stated he needed to meet with an attorney to ensure that Phoebe was his daughter, and that he claimed to be his mother's mother. Mr. Jonchuck told his mother he was her mother, and it was not him that had abused her when she was a little girl. Even though he was his mother's mother. I was your mother when you were a little girl, but it wasn't me who abused you. That's what his mother testified to in deposition. So confusion in a few fronts about who's parenting or who's parented who. And that's an example, and the way I interpret that is that's irrational thinking. That's illogical thinking that is clearly an indication of severe and persistent mental illness. That's the kind of confusion and lack of logic that you sometimes get.
Then did John go on to explain, I guess, best he could, or the events of January 7th up until and shortly after his arrest?
Yes.
Were there any inconsistencies in what John reported happening and what you were able to ascertain happened according to all the collateral sources?
Yes.
Did John tell you that he had a scheduled meeting with the attorney on January 7th?
He said the January 7th meeting was scheduled. That was the second of two meetings and second time he met with the attorney on 2 consecutive days.
Okay.
He said the January 7th meeting was scheduled. The attorney said the January 6th meeting was scheduled. The January 7th meeting, he just showed up and she was able to fit him in.
Did John tell you that Officer Vickers had activated his lights to initiate a traffic stop prior to John pulling over?
Mr. Jonchuck said that when he was driving south on the interstate, he pulled over because he saw flashing lights. That's what he told me. I reviewed Officer Vickers' report and deposition, and my understanding is Officer Vickers reported that he did not turn on the flashing lights until Mr. Jonchuck pulled over.
Was Mr. Jonchuck able to explain to you the path that he traveled after leaving the bridge?
He told me where he went and what he did after he dropped Phoebe over the side of the bridge, and that was contradicted by police reports.
Okay, so did he indicate that he got to, what did he say happened when he got to the toll booth?
I remember he said he got to the toll booth and there was a bunch of smoke, but he ultimately he made a U-turn, is what he said, meaning he never got over the Sunshine Skyway. That was his report to me. And I think it's pretty clear from the law enforcement records that he did get over the Sunshine Skyway and to I-75.
Did Mr. Jonchuck report to you that after he was finally stopped by the police, that there was a period of time that he was unconscious?
He told me he was unconscious, but the police did not, in their reports, did not describe him as unconscious or passed out or anything like that. They described him as sort of sitting there with his hands affixed to the steering wheel.
Did he indicate that he was taken to some sort of warehouse?
He reported being questioned in a warehouse, but I believe it ended up being some satellite or the office of the Manatee County Sheriff's Office, based on my review of other records, collateral documents, the law enforcement investigation.
Did he tell you that he was laughing insanely when he was at that warehouse or police station location?
They were his words, laughing insanely.
Did you have an opportunity to review the video from there?
Well, so for part of the time that he was at this facility, at least part of the time, he was video recorded and audio recorded, and I did not see him laughing. So it seems contradictory. Inconsistent.
Dr. Otto, I'm going to set up this checklist here, and we've talked about certainly in depth your opinion and your, that's backwards, and your belief, not a professor, and your belief that he does suffer from mental disease or defect. Now I want to look specifically at what evidence you observed indicating that Mr. Jonchuck did not know what he was doing or its consequences, or that his actions were wrong at the time, okay?
Right.
Do you believe he was significantly impaired by delusions or psychotic symptoms that would affect what he was doing and did not know whether it was wrong or not?
Yes.
Could you give us some examples?
Well, in terms of the delusions he was experiencing, I think he was paranoid. He believed his daughter was possessed. He believed, remember, she's chattering and putting her hand on the Bible. He had to get her baptized quickly, and he pursued an exorcism. Okay? He believed his daughter was possessed. He believed the world was coming to an end. He believed there was an ice age coming. He believed Michael the archangel, who was primarily responsible for protecting us from the devil, had fallen. Terrible things were going on. I submit to you that these are delusions. These are fixed, false beliefs. They're not changing. They're fixed. They're false. They're inaccurate. None of that was true. And they're his genuine beliefs, and we'll attribute them to a mental disorder and call them paranoid delusions. He had grandiose delusions. He was God or the Pope, depending on who he was talking to and who he was interacting with.
Can we approach?
Yes.
if you had finished that one or not.
What I said was, I think there were paranoid delusions. I think I
Gotcha.
listed them. I said, I think there were grandiose delusions. He was either God or the Pope, depending on who he talked to and how they responded to him. That's a fixed false belief. He's not the Pope. He's not God. It's not changing, and it's attributable to his mental disorder. And he will save the world. He will save the world by he and his daughter dying. He will save the world from this terrible outcome that will result. I think that's significantly impaired by delusions, and I also think there was impaired thinking. Not only was the content of what he was thinking impaired, right? The paranoid stuff, the grandiose stuff. How he was thinking, how logically he was thinking, how rationally he was thinking was impaired, right? So, for example, if you remember earlier in the day, his plan is to get baptized. He and Phoebe will get baptized at the church. And then his next response is, well, how about if I leave Phoebe here with you, Ms. Torres? That's illogical. That's irrational. At one point, he returned to one of the churches with his stepmother to prove she was still alive. That's irrational. And obviously thinking you're going to save the world. Obviously thinking you're going to save the world by putting yourself and your daughter over a bridge is irrational.
Was there anything about his driving pattern on the way to the bridge that was evidence of him not knowing what he was doing or the consequences or wrongfulness?
I thought this was significant, right? Obviously, you know, my opinion is that Mr. Jonchuck was very impaired by symptoms of mental illness, and that is largely what's to account for his behavior. If you have, I don't know everything you've heard. If you haven't heard it, you may well hear it. Some people may argue that he simply just wanted to kill his daughter. He wasn't impaired. Okay? Okay, well, let's think about that. My review of the police reports was that he was observed speeding and running a red light in Tampa. Okay? Now, what I'm thinking is if you're going to do this, and let's say you want to avoid detection, let's not speed. Let's not run red lights. If we're fully intact and everything's going fine. Then he comes to the attention of Officer Vickers, at least my reading of the arrest reports. Why did he come to the attention of Officer Vickers? Officer Vickers wrote in his report, and he testified in his deposition, he was going home at the end of a shift in a marked squad car, not undercover, on 275 South, and he sees a car speed by him. Okay, well, let's think about this, right? So one explanation is you just decide you're going to kill your daughter and get back at people. All right? Maybe avoid detection. Maybe avoid detection. Speed by the cop. Right? Draw attention to yourself. Get him to pull up behind you. So I think that's significant. And just the kind of recklessness of driving those rates of speed suggest impairment.
Once he stops at the bridge, was there any evidence on the bridge to support that Mr. Jonchuck did not understand the consequences or the wrongfulness of his actions?
In my opinion, yes.
And what would that be?
Mr. Jonchuck ultimately got out of the car, and the officer at some point pulled his weapon and trained it on Mr. Jonchuck and gave him commands. Mr. Jonchuck did not follow those commands. Risking being shot, I think any time an officer points a weapon at you, it's a fair assumption that you may be shot, at least if you're thinking logically, at least if you're thinking rationally. So he had an officer directing him to do things with a weapon trained on him. He ignored all those directions, I think it's fair to say. But that's not all. Then he took his daughter and in front of the officer threw her over the side of the bridge, right? Right in front of the officer. That doesn't prove that he didn't know what he was doing or didn't know what he was doing was wrong. But you have to ask yourself, if you were all together, if your plan, you were completely healthy and your plan to get back was to get back at someone, is that how this would play out? Is that how this would end up?
Did you observe any evidence from Mr. Jonchuck leaving the top of the Dick Meisner that would suggest he did not know what he was doing or the consequences or that it was wrong?
Well, he drove off. Now, one way to interpret that is he fled the scene. He committed a crime and he fled the scene. Therefore, he knew what he did was wrong. Right? Okay, that's one explanation. The other is he continued traveling south to avoid the ice age. I don't know what it was.
And does the fact that he calmly got back in his car and drove the scene, does that suggest whether he knew what he did was wrong or not?
I don't know. I don't know.
So should I check evidence for departing the scene or no?
I don't. You and every juror can take my opinion and my observations as they want.
Okay. Well, was there anything, did he ever use any aggression or active defiance towards the officer as he got back in his car and calmly left the scene?
The officer did not report.
Leading the witness.
Would you agree that a calm departure is inconsistent with fleeing? If the officer were to have described his departure as calm, would that be inconsistent with fleeing?
Yes. I also want to point, what I forgot to mention was my understanding is, based on the officer's report, is during this interaction with the gun trained on him, he informed the officer that he had no free will. I think that's indicative of impaired thinking.
That the officer had no free will.
Mr. Jonchuck was quoted by the officer as instructing him, "You have no free will." The man pointing a gun at him, he told the man pointing a gun at him that he had no free will. I see that as irrational. So I think that's significant in terms of his behavior during the stop.
All right. What, was there anything significant about his driving pattern after?
Well, again, law enforcement described him as attempting to elude them. That's one explanation. Interesting, there were reports that he was using his turn signals. There were reports that he was buckled. He had a safety belt on at the time he was ultimately apprehended. Again, you don't pick this up in psychology training, but I truly do wonder about the logic, if you're fleeing, of having the courtesy to use turn signals. But it raises questions for me.
Is there anything about Mr. Jonchuck fastening his seatbelt that would suggest he was not psychotic at the time?
Well, he might have fastened his seatbelt because he knew he was in for a scary ride. He might have fastened his seatbelt because it's sort of, at least for some people, reflexive. You know, it's sort of reflexive for me at this point, but two possible explanations.
Are people able to carry through with reflexive actions during a psychotic state?
Sure.
After Mr. Jonchuck was arrested at the scene, was there any evidence at that point that he did not know what he was doing or its consequences, or that it was wrong?
Yeah, I mean, I think evidence of his impairment is that he referred to himself as God and the Pope. He asked if he could leave the interrogation room. He demanded his Bible as he was at the scene in the vehicle. That suggests to me a lack of awareness of what's happening here and what's happened when you're demanding your Bible. And I believe it was either when he was being transported after the initial apprehension, I believe it was after then that he asked to be delivered to Babylon. It was either then or at another time he was being transported that evening. And I would suggest that a request to be transported to Babylon is indicative of impaired thinking.
What about a request to go to the airport?
Yeah, I know that request occurred later in the evening, what I believe to be his final transport, and I would suggest that if after you put your daughter over the side of the bridge, you're in custody and you ask if maybe the officer would be willing to drop you off at the airport because you have things to do, I think that suggests a lack of appreciation and understanding of what you did.
he will live is with him. Any idea what that means?
No,
Mr. Jonchuck tell you about that statement?
I don't think so.
Did John also ask during transport to the jail what he did wrong?
Yeah, at one point he asked what he did wrong, and he made a distinction between dropping his daughter off the side of the bridge and throwing his daughter off the side of the bridge. I see that as so impaired and so irrational, as if that makes a distinction. As if that makes a distinction in terms of the law, as a non-lawyer at least. And as if that makes a distinction in terms of the wrongfulness of what he did. Who cares? What's the relevance of that? And what I tell you is that's evidence of impaired rationality.
What about in the interrogation room? Did you observe any evidence from the interrogation room that Mr. Jonchuck did not know what he was doing, the consequences or wrongfulness?
He has to be let out of the interrogation room. He referred to himself as God and the Pope, and he referenced that. And I think that's all that comes to my memory regarding those issues.
Does he make reference to do you attribute any significance to the one comment that John said, Phoebe was my daughter, or she was my daughter?
I think it shows some appreciation that she was dead. I think it shows some appreciation of that, sure.
Could it be showing some appreciation that she's now a demon or now an angel or something to that effect?
Objection, this is leading.
Sustain.
Let's talk about, you had mentioned that John had expressed some belief that he and his daughter both must die.
That's what he said.
Or something to that effect.
He said that at one point, yes.
Okay. Mr. Jonchuck did not die.
Yes.
Does that mean that he was sane at the time?
No.
Does that make sense?
Well, it's inconsistent with, at least at one point, what he said his belief was, but this is the challenge. Most people are lucky enough never to experience symptoms of severe and persistent mental illness, the kind like Mr. Jonchuck has. And I think it's difficult, even for mental health professionals who interact with people like this all the time, to really experience it and know what it's like. The best way I try to make sense of this, and what I try to tell people when I've been involved in training contexts in the past is to try to really get an appreciation for what it's like. I think maybe the closest those of us come without severe and persistent mental illness is when we're dreaming. And if you can think back to just a wild dream that you might even call crazy, and all of the things that happened in the dream, right? That maybe you're sailing a plane in the ocean, and then a land shark comes up and saves you and takes you away. And then you transport back in time. And in the dream, it makes complete sense, right? You're living it out. And then you wake up and you say, that was a wild dream. That's impossible. That's irrational. That could never happen, right? So what I say is we can't, I can't, and I think we don't want to make the mistake of trying to impose our rationality on something that is characterized by being irrational, that is wholly impaired, right? Our rationality, our problem solving, our making sense of things comes in the absence of mental illness. We're trying to understand the behavior and actions of someone who we believe was in the throes of a terrible period of mental illness. So some of that just doesn't make sense. And that's the nature of mental illness. And in terms of trying to maybe get to it and appreciate it, maybe, at least how I get there, not having had that experience myself, is trying to think about how real things can seem in a dream, but how completely devoid of logic and rationality they can really be.
Now, I believe you had testified that psychosis doesn't just come and go real quickly. What about the severity of some of the psychotic symptoms? Do those fluctuate?
Yeah. What I would say is that the symptoms wax and wane. They get worse and they get better. What makes them worse? Maybe if you stop taking your medicine. Maybe if you run out of medicine. What makes them worse? Maybe if you start drinking a bunch of alcohol. What makes it worse? What if you're very, very stressed and there's a lot going on in your life? What makes it worse? What if you don't sleep for a few days? So the symptoms that anyone with severe and persistent mental experiences, the symptoms they experience can wax and wane in terms of how severe they are, depending on what's going on in your life, whether you're getting effective treatment, all kinds of things. But they don't just turn off, they don't just turn on, like you might see in a bad movie.
Can stress increase symptoms?
Certainly.
What about sleep deprivation?
Certainly.
In the interrogation room, there's periods of time where Mr. Jonchuck is just sitting there, and sometimes where he's answering questions. Is there anything about the interrogation video that is inconsistent with your opinion that Mr. Jonchuck was insane at the time of offense?
No, and I was just saying, it maybe gets to something I referenced yesterday, which is that we can't look for all people with severe and persistent mental illness to be, and I don't mean to be disparaging, maniacs, that they're bouncing off the walls, that they're I refer to that as the zombie theory of severe and persistent mental illness. That if you have severe and persistent mental illness, you just walk around like a zombie and you can't do anything, right? So that he sat there, that he answered questions, that he wasn't tearing up the room or anything, that doesn't prove that he wasn't experiencing symptoms of mental illness. That doesn't prove no mental illness, therefore sane, in my opinion.
May I approach the clerk, Judge? Dr. Owen, I'm showing you what's been introduced as defense A through D. May I approach the clerk, Judge?
What is that?
Defense Exhibit 8A through 8D, previously introduced. I want you to take a look at Defense 8A. If you just take a moment to look at that, I'm going to ask you what that is there.
Okay, 2 emails.
Okay. And the date of the email that Mr. Jonchuck sent, what's that one?
Mr. Jonchuck sent an email to Ms. Torres on August 25th, so the email indicates.
Okay.
August 25th of 2014.
And then I'm showing you also 8C. Eight B and 8D.
This looks like 7 or 8 emails
Okay.
transpiring between Mr. Jonchuck and Ms. Torres on January 7th, January 1st, December 31st. So they're kind of the second, when they started having contact, leading up to Phoebe's death.
All right.
Right.
And is there anything looking, so it looks like, did Mr. Jonchuck send an email on January 2nd at 1:14 in the afternoon?
That's how I interpret that. Here's an email from Mr. Jonchuck to Ms. Torres on January 2nd.
Could you read that email?
Let me just say this. There are 3 punctuation points in the paragraph.
Okay.
So do you want me, I'm going to read it and not punctuate it.
Okay. Unless there's punctuation?
Yeah.
Gotcha. Go ahead.
I'll take the punctuation cues. Thanks, we really need to do the non-removal because after doing visitation up there, I had concerns and called CPI, and Michelle said that she passed her drug test and was going to file false report and tried to get the retraining order, one for me and one for Phoebe, and it got denied and was recommended. I do that by the investigator. They had knives and live ammos, and she looked under the influence, and the guy she is with verbally scolded her harshly in front of me and has been arrested for DV on her twice at the 2118 Delightful Drive, Ruskin, Florida, 33570. His name is funny, but it's real Guy Kisser. Is there anyone at your office to sign the retainer? I told Michelle I was going to when you got back, and she stopped harassing us, but this is serious, Missy.
Okay. We're going to go back to that one. Could you read the email from August that John sent?
Reflecting the punctuation.
If there's punctuation in that one.
Mrs. Torres, it was a pleasure speaking with you on Friday. I can tell you that you were very... I'm sorry. My error. Mrs. Torres, it was a pleasure speaking with you on Friday. I can tell that you are very passionate about what you do and look forward to working with you. I will get the retainer back to your office ASAP. Thanks again for taking the time to answer my questions thoroughly. I can't wait for you to start working with me so we can put an end to the drama involving my daughter. She is my world and deserves a well-rounded, safe environment.
Was there, in fact, punctuation in August?
There was a lot of punctuation in that, and there was 3 punctuation points in January.
Gotcha. Was there anything about this January email that would give you any insight into Mr. Jonchuck's thought processes of what's going on at the time?
Right. The January email is evidence of impaired thinking. It's rambling. It's jumping from topic to topic without making a transition by way of punctuation. And I interpret it as reflecting impaired mental state. In January 2nd, that's very different from the August 25th email, which I interpret that as fully punctuated and not reflecting any kind of impaired thought process. No tangential thoughts jumping from topic to topic, no mistakenly presuming that maybe the reader of your email might understand something to which you're referring.
Can I have a moment, Judge? think I have about 5 more minutes. I'm not sure how.
Is 5 more
Either
minutes,
way.
you good to go? Okay, thank you, go ahead.
Dr. Otto, did Mr. Jonchuck tell you about calling a press conference that day?
Yeah, one of the things he said he did was sometime around the church visits was that he called a news station with the intention of holding a press conference. Exactly what he was going to announce at the press conference, I don't remember, but he specifically said he called a TV station with the intent of holding a press conference.
Were you able to verify in the phone records that he had in fact called Fox 13?
I was subsequently provided with phone logs indicating a call from his phone to Fox 13, a local station.
Okay. Are there any, going back to the interrogation room, are there other explanation when John referred to Phoebe in the past tense? Are there other potential other explanations other than knowing that she's deceased at that time?
You suggested one earlier. The only thing that occurred to me was, well, some appreciation or some, recognition that she was dead. Maybe he was thinking of her in another way. That didn't occur to me, honestly, but you offered it.
Is there anything inconsistent with that belief based on what you've observed? Did he consistently maintain that Phoebe was possessed or taken over by somebody?
Objection to leading us.
Did you observe any evidence that was inconsistent with a belief that Phoebe was possessed?
Objection. Same objection.
Did he observe any evidence? Did you review the state hospital records?
Yes.
The state hospital records would have been sometime after this happened, is that correct?
Sometime after what?
After Phoebe died.
Of course.
Why are those records important?
Because in any case of claimed insanity, you always want to make sure that the claimed or reported symptoms of mental illness are genuine. That people just aren't simply faking or making it up in order to avoid get out of trouble or avoid a situation. And what I reference in our training is that people like me who examine defendants, we can equate our evaluations to snapshots. We go into the hospital or the jail and we take, not literally, figuratively, we take a snapshot. During the hour or 2 hours, it was 7 hours, I think, that I spent with Mr. Jonchuck. Well, to follow the analogy closer, if I spend 7 hours with Mr. Jonchuck and take 3 snapshots, because I met with him 3 times, what I say is the staff at the hospital, they're taking a video recording, right? They're spending literally years with the defendant. Mr. Jonchuck was in the hospital for a long time, and they get to see him at all different settings. When he's eating, when he's interacting with other hospital residents, when he's in therapy, when he's in recreation, whatever other program they have going on at the forensic hospital. And I pay great deference to the state hospital employees, the forensic hospital employees, who have that kind of a look at a defendant and are able to form opinions about their impairments and the genuineness of their impairments. So I always make it a point to pay very special attention to people who've spent much, much more time with the defendant than I have, trying to figure out, what their impairments are and if they're genuine and things like that.
Do you have an opinion on whether Mr. Jonchuck was under the influence of drugs?
Yes.
And what was that?
Asked and answered.
May we approach?
We all know the answer. No, right?
Should I answer the question?
Yeah.
My answer is no.
Yeah.
Okay.
Or I have an opinion.
Right.
The answer is no.
Let's move on.
That he was not under the
Yes.
influence. Gotcha. And do you have an opinion on whether Mr. Jonchuck was feigning or faking mental illness at the time this happened?
Objection. This has also been asked and answered.
Sustained.
opinion ever changed on whether Mr. Jonchuck was faking any symptoms he exhibited at that time?
No.
And nothing further.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we'll take a break, especially for everybody, and we'll reconvene at 2:45. Please pass on the chairs. Thank you for your cooperation.
Everybody's out of the hearing of the court, Your Honor.
Okay, you got 15 minutes. Need to discuss anything?
According to the courtroom clock.